Hello and welcome to another episode of the Elite Coaching Blueprint podcast. On today's episode, we have Steve Hall, who is an incredible coach. He's also the host of the Revive Stronger podcast. And today we're going to be talking a hell of a lot about kind of programming, how you can get the best results out of your clients depending on their skill level and how advanced they are as a client, how you can work with clients who maybe are less adherent and get the best results with them. We also talk about stuff like genetics and what role that plays in terms of getting yourself results and again, your clients. We also talk about how AI might change the coaching industry and how you can work with clients' psychology, frame things and deliver things in the best way possible so that they buy into your coaching methods in the best way. And I think it was a very, very interesting chat. I really enjoyed that a lot. Definitely have learned some stuff myself as well that we can start to implement with clients. And yeah, if you are listening to this and you have found this in some way, shape, or form on the internet, off my Instagram, wherever it is, I would massively appreciate if number one, you could subscribe. But number two, if you could share this with other coaches and PTs. My main goal with this podcast is to help as many people as possible and to really grow this to be a fantastic resource to up level and upskill your coaching, delivery, and your systems. So without further ado, let's jump in and let Steve give himself a little bit of an introduction. Steve, do you want to just jump in and give yourself a little bit of an intro for anyone who may not know who you are and a little bit about your background?
Absolutely. So, yeah, thank you very much for having me on. It's always good to be on the other end because I am a podcast host myself, so I know kind of what this is all like. So, yeah, it's cool to be chatting. And yeah, for a brief background, I guess I always like to explain quickly, at least, where the name Revive Stronger came from. That is my kind of coaching company, content providing company in terms of the podcast that I run, where I get to interview experts within the field, which is really cool. But kind of Revive Stronger, just because it sounds, I guess, kind of fitnessy and cool. But what got me interested? Oh, I guess I was already interested in kind of training and trying to grow muscle initially. So always kind of active, interested in sports, but I never actually took like even GCSE, PE, or anything like that. I never even went down that route. It might be
Yeah.
interesting for some people who are coaches to like hear that someone like didn't even at that level. And then I went to university and I didn't take anything related to kind of being nothing like exercise science or nutrition or anything like that. I did geography of business. And that was largely because you probably know the type of people that are like jocks and that sort of
Yeah.
thing. And I was, unfortunately, I was a little bit bullied. I was kind of quiet and not very confident, but relatively good at sports. And that kind of led me to get picked on, unfortunately. And anyway, so that's why I didn't go down that route. But I found I always was coming back to like doing things with my nutrition, trying to grow muscle. I was playing football, I was like rowing, I was sprinting, I was doing everything when I was at university. And whilst I was at university, unfortunately, when I was on one of my typical like 10-kilometer runs, or maybe it was five, I'd be running around the campus. I had my Garmin watch on, my Garmin like chest strap that told me like my heart rate and everything. And I was like into all of the gadgets.
Yeah.
And when I was on one of these, some lights were flashing amber essentially. And I just kind of was like, I'm on for an all time PB. I'm going for it. Then as I go, I look right and there's a van and it hits me. And I got the kind of short term things of that was just like some scarring. I've still got scarring on my elbow and on my back where I think had to do a few stitches, but they were nothing of my concern. I
Mm.
fractured my skull at the time. And then it wasn't until I left the hospital after a couple of days and I went home, ended up essentially kind of having like a little bit of a panic attack slash like just like my sodium levels essentially were like rock bottom, and that led me to like having a bit of a fit essentially.
Wow.
And so, yeah, I was taken into A&E immediately by my parents, and
Was
then I
that
stayed in.
like a hyponatremia kind of thing? Yeah.
Yes, yeah, that's it.
Yeah.
I always get the so it would be hyper. No,
Hy-
no, no, hypo,
Well,
right?
hypo, one of them. I always get
Hypo.
confused between the
Yeah,
hypo
I
and
know. I try and remember it because I'm like hyper is like hypertrophy, so it's
yeah,
more.
too
So
much. Yeah.
hypo would be yeah the opposite of that. So
Under.
basically, my body was not in a good state. What seemed to have happened is I had a bruised pituitary gland or something related to kind of yeah my hormonal control of like my electrolytes, but also testosterone and things like this. And then I was in hospital for a month because they were essentially like you could if you're go like hypo or hyponatremia for a period of time, like you could have a fit and like you had a real issue, like problem if you weren't kind of seen to immediately. So the quickest way to lose your gains, I always say, is like don't eat and just lie in like a hospital bed because I went in not very muscular. Like I'd made some of the like newbie gains and all that sort of thing. I thought I was like muscular and I had a good build. Reality, I was maybe like early intermediate kind of look.
Yeah.
Certainly wasn't like a genetic gift in terms of like growing muscle. So I basically kind of lost all of that and I was at ground zero. And so coming out of hospital, I very much was in my shell. I was still at university going through my third year. I didn't defer. I was given the option. I was just like hard headed. I'm going to kind of complete my third year.
Yeah.
And it led to me just not being very social because I was on a fluid restriction due to kind of the hyponatremia. And I was having 250 mils of fluids a day. I remember this because I had an innocent bottle smoothie, like the little ones, and that's all I could drink for the whole day, which is mad. And so anyway, kind of through this, I found the gym because that's the one place I kind of felt quote unquote safe and in
Yeah.
control. The control element was big for me. And I think it can be almost like if you take it to the extreme, that's where like eating disorders come in with that level of control. And I've certainly been towards that end before. I've never been diagnosed with the eating disorder. I
Mm.
don't think I ever was that bad. But certainly the control of going into the gym, eating a certain way, seeing my body change and trying to build back the muscle I lost. And that just led me down a route and a rabbit hole of trying to learn more and more about how does hypertrophy happen? How do I grow muscle? How to get the best results? And like when I was getting into it, it was like forums and magazines were like, there was not
Yeah.
anywhere near as much like information as there is now. I wish the podcast like that I put out there now or a podcast like yours, Jack, was there available because there just wasn't that information. So I made so many mistakes. I did the dirty bulk. I did like the warrior diet. I did like all these different training regimes and all sorts. So it
I
took me
think,
down a path.
sorry, go on, Karen.
No, it's all right, Jack. Go on.
I was going to say, I think with what you were just saying there as well is, there's definitely been a huge change and we'll maybe talk about this a little bit later on, is like a huge change in the amount of information you've got. And there are pros to that. But there's also a lot of cons to that. But I even remember back in when I was kind of trying to sort of start getting in shape and looking at, I was training pretty effectively. Or well, what I thought was pretty effectively. I was training relatively hard, but nutrition wise, I remember trying to work out my macros and my calories, like just calories, protein, carbs, and fats. And it was like doing like some complex kind of statistics. And I was just like, what on earth's going on? Nowadays, you can just type them into the internet and like pop them out and, oh, there you go, easy. And it's pretty accurate. But back in the day, you'd have to really kind of figure it out. Or even if you did have access to doing that stuff on the internet, like we're not talking ages and ages ago, like the internet was about. But I remember just, there was no kind of clear choice of what to do. So that's a huge point as well.
Yeah, it was very much anecdotal support
Yes.
was where you went. And so I'd like talk to the big guys in the gym. He'd be like, oh, can you train 5 days a week? If you can train every muscle group once a week and just like drive it into the ground. And
Yeah.
I can remember just like dumbbell pressing and being like, why am I getting worse? It's because I had no idea about fatigue management and as an example. And like nutrition, again, I was just like, yeah, clean food, lots of protein. So I'd be perpetually just under eating. Like I was a very skinny kid. And I remember like people in the gym would be like, you're so dry, but you don't have that much muscle. And dry meant like lean because I was just perpetually in a calorie deficit. So no wonder I wasn't growing much muscle. It wasn't until I found the likes of, I think the first people I kind of came across, and I would call this like evidence-based fitness, which has kind of got a little bit of a bad name, bad rap to it almost now, because I think people abuse that term and they take it the wrong way. And this is, like you said, that information overload, and people like use PubMed to like prove stuff and everything has to have a PM ID or whatever. It's like, it's gone too far the other way. But I came across, and I wonder, I don't know if I imagine you're familiar with these names, Jack, but you might not even be, because they're kind of, they were like the old school, like evidence-based guys, like from over a decade ago, but like Lar McDonald, bodyrecomposition.com, and like Alan Aragon for the nutritional side. Matt Ogus, I'm sure you're aware of Matt Ogus.
Matt, no, actually.
Oh,
no.
you know? Okay.
No.
So he was big on YouTube at the time. He's not like a scientist, like not a researcher or anything, but he was being coached by Eric Helms from 3DMJ, who are quite big kind of in that side of things. And Eric's a researcher himself. Anyway, he was a big inspiration for me to then compete in natural bodybuilding and go down that route. So I started learning from them. And then I was like, screw it. Like I've seen this guy, Matt, who I really aspire to his physique and his knowledge and everything. I'm going to like actually try and prove to myself I'm recovered from my accident and take to the natural bodybuilding stage. And just as I was kind of looking to do that, I also quit my day job. And as I was living at home, it wasn't a big risk. I became a one-on-one PT in my local gym. But at that time, as you imagine when you're in a calorie deficit, but particularly when you're trying to lose like over 10% of your body weight and you're trying to get like glute striations. I had no energy. So one-on-one PT is like the worst thing for someone who's an introvert, who's new to the field, and then like no energy. So I was just like not good for like sales and talking to people. So what ended up happening was there was kind of a lot of locals in the gym of like younger guys who saw me and they're like, man, you lift in a different way. Man, you're getting shredded. How are you doing this? I started talking to them and I took them online as clients. So I started growing this online base of clients. And that led me to then develop what is Revive Stronger, which is where I was getting to with the name. It's kind of like I took myself from ground, like the worst shape I've ever been in my life, out of hospital, really not well. Used
Yeah.
a lot of like the principles of bodybuilding in terms of nutrition, training to build myself up and actually take myself to like the most extreme level that you can almost go to with the natural bodybuilding stage, and then actually recover after the natural bodybuilding stage and be in like the best shape of my life and be healthy. And doing that proved not just to myself that I'd recovered from my accident and kind of the ill health that I had, but also that I can probably do this for a lot of others. And so
Yeah.
it just gave me a lot of confidence. And so that's where Revive Stronger kind of initially came from. That's where my interest really came from. And it's just grown since then. So people like Lyle McDonald, for example, he's been on my podcast that I now have. And I
Yeah.
have other researchers in the field and other practitioners. And I really started that podcast just to share great information. And now it's kind of drove a lot of obviously business my way too, which has been fantastic. And it just has continued down that path. And I continue to just like grow as a practitioner and as a bodybuilder myself. I still competed in 2021 and did all right. Went to WMBF World. So yeah, that kind of gives an insight into where I've been and where we've got to. And now Revive Stronger is not just me. I have a business partner in Pascal Floor, and we have two coaches on the team as well, Ryan Solomon and Mike Chalice, who is also a physio. So we have thankfully a
Yeah.
physio on the team, which is really great, as we were talking about in the gym that one time, where it's tricky because there's a lot to physiotherapy, which is why they have a degree and everything. They have to go and get very educated and become a professional.
Yeah, massively. I think as well, like it's kind of a really, I suppose, a bit more of a unique way into doing this because, like you said, like you've come from a position where actually you've had to learn a lot of the stuff, maybe yourself, going through things, sort of trial and error. And I think that's definitely a huge learning curve, especially, I suppose, like when was it that you started on the online sort of space as well?
About 2014, maybe
Yeah.
2013, end of 2013. But yeah, so I've been here, I mean, yeah, a while now, coming
Yeah.
towards the
So
decade.
exactly. So there's a big amount that, I mean, even back in sort of 2014, I'm trying to think what sort of trends were in place then. It was all about kind of
If it fits your
carb
macros.
cycling, if it's macros, there was loads of stuff about like, yeah, there was loads of stuff that was like, I suppose it's kind of marginal improvements you can get from these things, but they're not like the bread and butter, but they were being treated like they were bread and butter
Yeah,
by almost everyone. I think nowadays it's kind of changed, but um, yeah, I
yeah.
think from obviously
Do you remember DUP? That was big, and Jim Wendler's 531, daily undulating
531, I remember.
periodization. It
Yes.
was like everyone was like the DUP, and Lane Norton had like his fat routine or something. That
Yeah,
was big back
PHAT.
then.
Yes, I remember.
Yeah,
Yeah, I remember that as well. But I'd never heard of DUP as well referred to as that. But there was so much stuff that was kind of like, yeah, things like that that were being treated as gospel, and they weren't like the kind of core bits that you need. Maybe important things that you can use, but I think where like things have changed nowadays, it has kind of almost done a bit of a full circle back to, you know what, the basics are kind of what you really need, and that is the real core parts. And I think from working with you over the last few months, and this has kind of been an ethos which I've not really seen with a lot of other coaches, is there's typically this huge push. And I did a podcast with the other day with Aaron from Mofo Body Mechanics. So he's a physiotherapist. He does some amazing work. He's who helped me kind of rehab my knee injury. And we were talking a little bit about kind of the practicality of programming and training. And he sort of, his point of view was, you know, you shouldn't really enjoy training, I think is the way he put it. I don't think he was saying like it should be unenjoyable, but I think his kind of standpoint was like, it's a means to an end. It does, you don't need to be going in and enjoying absolutely 100%. Now, my kind of point of view in that is I don't fully agree with that. I think I agree with the sentiment of maybe if you're going into a sport and you're very competitive in it and something, that there is an argument for, look, you need to do the stuff that's going to get you the results. And if you don't enjoy it, then maybe don't compete kind of thing. But for the most part, I think there is also the sort of there's the opinion out there that it should just all be enjoyable. And I think I sit somewhere in the middle. I think you should have things that, there might be the most optimal things and getting the most out of your training and helping you get the best results, especially with your own clients as well. But equally, I think training shouldn't be unenjoyable. I think that makes it very hard to be consistent with and stay on track with. Since I've been training with you, for example, I think I've noticed with a lot of the programming, it is the core basics. And I think this is where it comes down to, working with clients for the most part, depending on the population you're working with. A lot of coaches will be programming a lot of changing in for their clients. They'll be changing exercises up very regularly, changing up routines, exercises in and out for other things, clients getting a little bit bored with things. But equally, we all know, I think, that there is a level of just progressing the same lifts over and over and just keeping that going over time. And it's boring shit. For you, what's the kind of standpoint on where do you sit on that spectrum of training is just a means to an end up to training should be enjoyable and you should love it? What's your kind of viewpoint on that? And how do you think you at most practically or pragmatically seeing kind of results with people?
Yeah, it's a great discussion actually. When you say it, I immediately think about the nutritional side, where I'm
Sure.
like, how much are you just a robot and you're eating macros to get to an outcome? But we all know food fucking tastes amazing, and we have
Yeah.
preferences, right?
Yeah.
And so if follow a strict meal plan where this is all you can eat and you can't have anything off limits, eventually something's going to crack. You're gonna have to program yourself cheat meals and use those
Sure.
or something, and or your adherence is going to be poor. So there's got to be an element of your program that achieves, like, again, the principles, which might be these macros, micronutrients, those sort of things. But then you've got to have some things in there that you just enjoy,
Mhm.
like you're flexible within that, and there's no need to be kind of rigid and restrictive to certain foods. Same with training, I see it as like, right, yeah, I mean, there's going to have to be an element of like things that you're going to have to achieve. So you're going to have to achieve a certain amount of stimulus to a muscle group through, therefore, you're limited to a certain number of exercises. Like if you want to build big quads, you're going to have to do a variant of a
Yeah.
squat, probably, or a lunge or a leg. Like you're going to have some maybe leg extensions. Like if you hate every quad exercise out there, it's like, well, then
What do
maybe, yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. So I think it's just a case of trying to figure out what exercises you do enjoy, but still with those, there's going to be an element of, okay, like you said, you need to have them in for an extended period of time. And I think the thing that people sometimes don't enjoy is the discomfort. But without
Yeah.
discomfort and without that overload and stress, like you're not going to change. Like
No.
pressure builds diamonds. Like everyone knows, if you don't cause enough of a stress or a kind of issue for you, you're not going to change. You're not going to adapt and improve. So if people are always changing exercises, and exercises are a skill, if you keep changing exercises, yeah, you might improve in it for like the 4 weeks you have it in there, and then you rotate a new one in, but you are
Mm.
actually getting better, or you relearning it and kind of putting that back in. And I try and identify kind of, right, let's find pleasure in the outcome and in the result versus just like going in there and executing it. But where possible within kind of our means of meeting principles that we need to for hypertrophy or the specific outcome we're trying to train for, let's
Sure.
find things that you enjoy more, kind of like the nutrition. Like, okay, so you hate chicken and rice. You don't
Yeah.
have to eat chicken and rice. You can have turkey and couscous. Like, it's cool.
Yeah.
So long as we get what we need from that. Same with training. If you hate barbell back squats, totally fine. Maybe we can find a hack squat that suits you, or vice versa. But we're going to have to eat some protein and some carbs. We're going to have to put some tension through that quad and overload it over time. Hopefully that makes sense. Like kind of where my stance is. And just to finish it, I think what you mentioned there was really good, in that I think there's an element of like the individual. There's people who are more to the side of just more general pop, more like that they aren't after like the optimal. They're just happy to progress. And you probably have to treat more like, you probably have to enjoy your training more, because you won't adhere if you don't enjoy most of it. Whereas you have then your like competitors, maybe the people I'm taking to stage, they're in the off season, they want to go pro next year. You better nut up and like get it done,
Yeah.
because this is what you need to do, even if you don't. Like for me, as an example, like I would love to go pro as a natural bodybuilder. I hate training my abs. Fucking sucks. Who likes training abs? I don't know. But
No.
I don't have thick abs. So if I want my abs to show on stage, and that for not to be a weakness that the judge is going to point at me and be like, that guy, yeah, he could have taken it, but if he had slightly thicker abs or something, I'm like, right, the goal of me achieving that pro card is more important than my disdain for training abs. let's get those abs trained because I know I need to.
Absolutely. So I think there's two things you've mentioned there, which are actually really, really good topics to touch on. First of all, I think with regards to like what you're saying there about what do you kind of enjoy and what you're trying to achieve from it really. So let's say, for example, you're going for a stage prep or you're going for a photo shoot prep, or you've got like a sport that you are just really keen on, you want to compete in that. Well, I think that's where you step in and say, look, there's probably going to be some stuff you don't necessarily enjoy, but do you want the outcome? Because if you want the outcome, then you're going to have to do the things that come to get to that point, right? So for example, someone who is trying to build muscle and lose fat, they have the exact same goals as a professional bodybuilder in like the wider way of saying it, right? But it's how extreme does one person want to go versus the other person, right? So a bodybuilder goes into that position. They've got the exact same goals of building muscle, dropping body fat, but they want to take both of those values to the extreme. So they value being able to step on stage, being in a very competitive position, like you're saying, like training abs, not necessarily something you enjoy, but if you want to be in a competitive position for that, you have to go and do those things that you don't necessarily enjoy. So I agree on that side of the spectrum where it's like, okay, cool. There are things that you have to do. It's just the way the world is. And that's, if you want the result, you have to do them. Equally, there's the complete other end of the spectrum where I think it's maybe more gen pop rely on this. There is an element of you have to enjoy your training. And I think if you're trying to push your clients a little bit in the position where they don't enjoy it, they hate it, well, for the most part, if they don't value the outcome so much, or it's not as extreme about an outcome, it's very easy to lose sight of what you're trying to achieve because you don't enjoy it as much, or you are just not enjoying the style of training as much, or it's just getting a bit boring to you. So I think when it comes down to sort of programming for clients, you got to really think like how much do they want this goal, and to what extent do they want this goal? That makes a big difference in terms of, what you program it. But I think the second thing there as well, and this is something we sort of touched upon with Aaron actually, again from Mofo, was when it comes to sort of changing up programs. So what I've just said there, like, you got those two different ends of the spectrum. You do have those people who they want a bit more flexibility. They want a bit more change. They want to just enjoy training for the sake of training. There's two things within that, I think. The first is, are they training to train, quote unquote? Are they looking to get stronger? Are they looking to progress lifts? Are they looking to do all those kind of things, right? See some kind of adaptation in their body. If the answer is yes, then they're probably going to have to do a little bit more of the things they don't particularly enjoy. And that might mean sticking to a program for a little bit longer than, 3-4 weeks kind of thing before changing. If they're just doing it for general health, well-being, getting up, moving, that is what I would consider exercise. So I think the two differentiations there are training versus exercise. They're two very different things. They're two very different ends of the spectrum. Training is to achieve those adaptations more and is maybe something that's more tracked. But exercise is just general health, well-being, moving your body. It might be something that your parents do or your grandparents do just to keep active and not like see their body break down. So I think that's a really important thing. But going on to what we were saying there, I was saying with Aaron, is if you are training, so quote unquote training and looking for those adaptations more, I think the first like 5 to 6 weeks of any program, any kind of adaptations you're seeing, he was talking about how a lot of that can be, your central nervous system just firing better, your kind of neurological changes and things like that. Neurological, the right word? I think the right word there. Yeah. So like neurological changes and basically your body just being better at performing movements rather than seeing exactly skill-based movements. And kind of going back to what you were saying before, there's a lot of adaptations in there that are skill-based movements. So you don't typically see much kind of actual strength improvements from muscles getting stronger until about 5, 6 weeks into a program. So if you're going in and programming for your clients and changing everything within 6 weeks and all the movements have changed, they don't really get any benefit out of what they're trying to achieve. So you need to run movements for longer than, 6 weeks. Now, depending how long you think a block can run and how much you can get out of that doesn't mean that you're not going to maybe need a deload. That doesn't mean that you're not going to push for progression within that block. But what it does mean is that you need to keep some of the core lifts the same. So if you've got a lot of clients who like a lot of the changes and they like a lot of new sort of stimulus and just keeping it exciting, I think one of the things you could maybe utilize there and maybe lean into a bit more is going, okay, cool. I'm happy to do this. I'm happy to program some different things here, but we do need to keep some really core fundamental movements in your program that are maybe the big compound lifts. It could be a squat or like a pressing movement with your legs. It could be a pressing movement up at top and like a pulling movement up top, and keep them pretty consistent to see that progression throughout blocks and see that kind of, I suppose, more strength adaptations as you go through training. What are your thoughts on something like that?
Yeah, I mean, even bring it all the way back to the spectrum, I think that was
Yeah.
brilliant in terms of like where do you lie on this spectrum? You all the way extreme over here where like you need this rigidity and structure and your goals are the most important thing versus down here, like where do you lie on that? And then
Mm.
identifying, well, where does your client lie on that? And then you can identify things. I think something you've done here really well is also just explaining, you could explain the upsides and downsides. So you can explain to your client why they need to run an exercise for an extended period of time because like you said, they're learning the skill of that movement. And then past that, like first month of using it or so, now we're
Mm.
seeing like those improvements are more indicative of you growing new muscle tissue. It's like,
Yeah.
how are we measuring growth of new muscle tissue? Probably the like most clear way to do it for at the moment, at least, because we're not kind of going into the lab and like getting a
Yeah.
like getting muscle biopsies or anything. It is like strength progression within like the hypertrophy rep range. Like that's a clear way to do it. And I love the idea of core lifts because it is those kind of more complex lifts that there's more skill involved. Whereas for your
Mm.
isolation based lifts, they're the ones I was gonna actually say it, but you said it already, was like they're the ones you can probably more freely be like, okay, so if you're not enjoying this one, how much skill does it take to flex your elbow? Not much. You go in a preacher curl, you're gonna get pretty decent bicep like adaptations versus just standing and doing a bicep curl. Yeah, there's some skill component, but for someone who kind of knows how to do it, they're not losing out a bunch. But if you go from a barbell back squat for 6 weeks and then you go to a hack squat or a Smith machine or belt squat, like they all just they're slightly different in that way. So you want to just have one of those in there for that much longer and make sure not to remove it until there's actually a need to versus just wanting to. And as coaches, I think because there is so much less skill to isolation based movements, you can vary those more freely. And that's where maybe they get their kick and their enjoyment out of it. And then you keep those kind of core fundamentals, like you mentioned.
Yeah. So I think where you said there, actually, the kind of getting the kick out of it and the enjoyment out of it, there was something that I've been thinking recently has been around kind of adding a little bit more athletic training to things. And I've also seen this with a lot of coaches have stepped almost away from the more bodybuilding style of training, which I think has been very, very popular in terms of getting stronger at lifts, progressing and things like that. And a lot of people are now looking more towards general sort of health, functionality, being able to move properly, longevity within training, but also that kind of athletic pursuit or being more athletic within their training, right? So I think a really easy way that you can help clients maybe enjoy their training a lot more, see, better adaptations out of what they're doing, and maybe adhere to things a little bit longer term is I do see a lot of value in the more bodybuilding style of training. Let's call it bodybuilding style of training, where you're kind of pushing, progressive overload, trying to get strong, week on week, month on month, kind of for the most part. I think adding in maybe even just a day or like a movement to the end of sessions that is a little bit more functional or athletic can be a really good way to make training more exciting because you're not moving in just straight lines. It's like left and right, front and back, right, for the most part. If you start adding in things that are maybe some box jumps, it could be something like a sled push or a sled pull. It could be, things like that are requiring a little bit more rotation, things that maybe have, I don't know if the right word is more carryover to real life, like sandbags and things like that. Almost kind of like strongman style of training, right? A little bit different modalities and stimulus. I think that actually has maybe a little bit more carryover to a client's lifespan in terms of them just staying on as a client, but also them enjoying things for the most part so that they can get their kick out of their training, but they also have the ability to stick to the days where they see the need for it. And if you can explain to them like, hey, this is going to carry over to the athletic side. So let's say you do let's say you're programming like a more a strongman style training day. So it could be, farmers carry some sandbags over the shoulders. It could be maybe even some like CrossFit style movements, like Olympic lifts and things like that. Something like that. They're quite high skill level, but I think they have a lot more enjoyment to them because I think a lot of people get very bored just sat doing like the same movement and not really moving around much. You can explain that has a carryover to the hypertrophy style of training. You probably have a better cardio ability, and you can probably, that has a carryover to being able to be more efficient with your lifts. But equally, the strength and the more hypertrophy style training, I think probably has a lot of carryover to the other side. And I think in that way, that could be a very good way of maybe programming for clients. For someone like yourself, your background's very much more bodybuilding, and it's very much more competing. That doesn't so much marry up with what your maybe background is and what typically would go with. For you, what do you feel is maybe is that something that it's maybe counterintuitive to your clients' goals, but do you feel like in the bigger picture, that's something smart, or do you feel like that maybe could be a little bit counterintuitive to what most people are trying to achieve?
Yeah, it's certainly interesting as you're talking me through it. I was kind of thinking back to something you said where a lot of your more Gen Pop clients, they're not
Mm.
bodybuilders, but they have the same aspirations, but less extreme than bodybuilders. Like they still
Yeah.
want like a lower body fat with more muscle mass generally. Generally, but some people don't even necessarily want that. They want maybe a bit of hypertrophy, but they also want like a good cardiovascular base,
Mm.
and they want a mix of outcomes. And so I think for someone like that, that makes complete sense. I'm, like you said, very different because
Yeah.
most of my clients know they're coming to me because they're like, Steve is someone who specializes in muscle growth and fat loss, and like everything we'll be doing together is driving towards those goals. I don't tend to get clients coming to me with like, they want to do some powerlifting, they want to do some strongman, they want to do a variety of things. That's probably more what I would have got when I was a PT actually,
Yeah.
versus where I am now. So it's every client I have, thankfully, allows me to be very efficient with my clients because I don't have to start learning so much about those things
Yeah.
you're
Yeah.
talking about, where I wouldn't necessarily know exactly where to start with that, especially to make it progressive. But I do have some more Gen Pop clients, and some of them have kind of suggested that they would like to incorporate some of the things you mentioned there. And I kind of call these like general physical preparedness days. And
Yeah.
that's why we might have like a circuit of like, right, we're going to do a squat pattern. It might be like a goblet squat or something like this, then like a rowing pattern. And like we move through this circuit. And I don't need to know like the ins and outs of the benefits of that. It's just they want to go in there, they want to move their body, and it's different to cardio, maybe that they don't actually want to go and like just be on the bike, but they still want to go in there, burn some calories. And again, like you said, they're not someone who like has ambitions to step on the stage. They want to grow a bit of muscle. They want to stay fit. They want to enjoy things. And so I think that's where, at least as a coach, like listen to your clients. Like I could have been like,
Mm.
dude, no, what we're
Yeah.
doing here and what I do is bodybuilding. I'm not going to program you something else. It's like, well, actually, that was quite a like easy thing that I could incorporate. And then you can always monitor it. It's similar to like a client who's playing football or does Brazilian jiu-jitsu on the side or whatever it might be. It's like we can incorporate those into our goals and then measure how much of an impact they're having on them. And if it can be kind of complementary, like you mentioned, then awesome, let's do that. Because otherwise, a lot of people look at bodybuilding or bodybuilding style training and they're like, I have to go all in or nothing else. It's like, well, no, you can kind of have emphasis and de-emphasis on things. As long as you're doing enough to see adaptations and improvement in that area, then sure, you can have something else on the side. You don't have to train the way I train. You
Yeah.
can kind of use a mix of things. So yeah, for sure. If again, like if coaches have clients who are like, I'm really bored of this, can we add something different in? And they're just like not hearing them and they're not listening and they're not open to that, like no wonder that client's going to move on because they're going to find someone like yourself, Jack, who's going to be like, yeah, sure, we can incorporate a little
Mm.
bit of this on the side. Just know that like we have to just identify if it's going to start impacting things and discuss that if it does. But let's hope that it doesn't. Let's kind of see where things go. And maybe if they're going all out 6 days a week, like hypertrophy training, you're like, right, maybe we need to scale that back to 5 to
Yeah.
allow for some recoverability for this other thing, depending on what it is, like you said.
So I think that's a really good way of approaching it. And I think what you said there about as well, um, the general physical preparedness days, right? Is you said particularly them you don't maybe know as much sorry, you may not know as well how to overload those things. And I think this is kind of where I've got little bit of a gripes with like CrossFit, for example, or things like turf games, high rocks and things like that. I actually really enjoy doing them and I think they're very enjoyable to do. But I don't think there's as much, maybe going back to what I was saying before about training versus exercise. I see them more as exercise because you go to a CrossFit class, you might do a back squat movement, right? 1 week, but it's the whole point of CrossFit is that it's random, that it's not like a progressive thing that you can kind of go, okay, I've got this next coming next week and the next class is this. it's very much all up in the air. And it's the whole point of it is that maybe the adaptation you're looking for there is overall fitness and overall capacity to be able to do work in many different functions and ways, right? But it's not training in the sense that you would go in and do a back squat and then be able to progress that back squat over time and say, I'm definitely getting stronger at this, because there's so many factors at play there. So for example, number one is 1 month you might do back squat 3 times, and then the following month you might do back squat once, just because of the classes you went to and the amount of time you had available. Then 1 month you might do more classes. The second month you might do less classes, or you might do more of a different style of class. So there's no way really to track as accurately if you're getting stronger in your training, because you might go do that back squat. Let's use back squat as the example. You might go do that back squat, and week 1, you do 150 kilos, right? 5 reps of 5, 150 kilos. So you go through and do that session. Following week, you might be more burnt out than usual. So the five sets of 5 is really fucking difficult. Then the following week, you're more recovered than you were the previous week. So suddenly that 5 sets of 5 at 150 is easy again. And then you don't do it for 4 weeks. So then you're not sure where anything is. So there's no sort of real way to go, okay, cool. Last week I did 3 sets of this for 10 reps and I did that at 150 kilos. Amazing. Cool. Next week I did 11 reps for 150 kilos. Cool. Amazing. I've seen a little bit of progression there. And you can very accurately see how that's going, especially if you're tracking your recovery between stuff. You can see, okay, cool. The amount of work I'm doing and the amount of load I'm moving, or one or the other, has improved. And my recovery is either the same or it has deteriorated a little bit. And that's where you can make those changes within what you're doing to say, okay, I'm definitely getting stronger here. I feel like when it goes to more training or exercising style of training, you can't accurately predict, am I getting stronger at this? Am I seeing adaptations from my training? So I think when it comes to coaches programming this for their clients, I think that is the only downside, is that if you don't stick to movements that you can maybe more accurately track, it does become a little difficult to see progression in there. But I suppose the question there is, are you using this to see progression, or are you using this to be more of an enjoyable thing that's going to make clients adhere to things longer term and allow you to program maybe a more training style of programming that's, a little bit more rigid, this amount of sets, this amount of reps, and help sort of, clients actually see that progression within their training longer term than just changing everything up every sort of 2, 3, 4 weeks kind of style. I think that's a big thing in there. One of the things I wanted to talk to you about today as well, and this is again something that I've been banging on about for, I feel like, years, and I feel like there's only a few people who I've actually seen who maybe have the same, or not, maybe there's a lot of people who have the same idea behind it, but I don't see it nearly enough in the general coaching population of coaches, PTs, is the amount of volume people prescribe for clients and even in their own training. So I work with a lot of coaches, and the ones who I coach in their fitness, a lot of them feel like they need a lot more volume than they actually do require. So I'm going to come back to a post you put up the other day, actually, in a second, but they almost think they need more volume than they need. And equally, I think they give their clients a lot more volume than they need. Now, we were talking about skill before. I think this is where a lot of skill comes into stuff, because if you are more skilled, you don't need as much work because you can more effectively train. You also are probably, if you're more skilled, you probably have a higher training age compared to maybe a general population client. So let's make this easier to talk about. Let's talk about someone who is general population, not a lot of skill, not a lot of training years, or effective training years, let's call them, versus someone who is maybe a little bit more skilled and they have a higher training age. Okay, so you've got those two kind of ends of the spectrum. The people who are less skilled, less training age, they probably actually do warrant a little bit more volume. And the reason is because the volume they're doing comparatively to someone more skilled isn't going to get the same stimulus out of it, right? So if you had a skilled person versus an unskilled person, if you compared how much of a stimulus they get out of something, how much work they get out of something, how effective something was for them, the skilled person would get more out of the same movement for the same reps at the same load than the unskilled person, because they can more effectively do that movement. I would say there is an argument for maybe giving slightly higher volume to less skilled individuals to get a better stimulus out of them. Conversely, I think people can go almost too far with that and think that they are so skilled that they need 4, 5, 6 sets on movements, and every body part per session just needs like just a billion sets, and they feel like they're just never doing enough work, and they've always got to leave the gym with just this kind of like skin tearing pump in their pecs and stuff like that. I think there's a big spectrum of skill versus what you require. And just to kind of round that point up, and I'm going to kind of just say what I've got to say and then let you go. You put a post up the other day, which I really loved, was about, you said you got a theory that, obviously over time, your volume requirements go up, but that doesn't mean that they have to always go up, because you can increase your skill and your ability to train a muscle and kind of increase that stimulus when you are training to bring that volume requirement down. So although, yes, your training age has gone up and you probably do need a little bit more volume, that doesn't mean that it's got to just shoot up straight away, because you can increase your skill level at a movement and actually probably bring that volume requirement down. I'm just going to kind of let you loose on that. I'm not going to ask any specific question, just let you sort of go with
Yeah.
your kind of thoughts.
Yeah, super interesting. Something I've been discussing with one of my clients who is actually a researcher, and he's a professor, Dr. Jake Reed. He works for Renaissance Periodization, and I'm fortunate enough to be his coach. We sometimes like talk about these sort of like more theoretical ideas and concepts. And he brought up the idea of, we're not necessarily looking for like a certain volume, we're actually looking for a stimulus. And when you put it that way, it makes it far clearer with these sort of things, because it's like you mentioned, that more skilled person, they don't need more stimulus. They need they need a certain level of stimulus. And if they're more efficient at getting it, their volume might actually come down, because theoretically their volume should go up, because as you adapt, you need like more work to meet the threshold, to meet the stress overload, to create the adaptation. But if you are calling it a stimulus threshold, and if they're more efficient at the movements and they're stronger and better equipped at creating mechanical tension and doing the movement pattern effectively for the muscle group, they actually could use less volume to get that same stimulus. Whereas the person who's really unskilled, they are like scrambling around trying to get this stimulus, and they might have to have like you mentioned, if they're less skilled, they probably need to practice more and more and more to get the skill. I do think that, like you said, it can go too far, because I always use this analogy of, if you've got like, I don't know, 10 tasks to do in the day, and you're like, holy shit, that's a lot of work. You're not going to give your best efforts to every single task. You're just going to do the bare minimum to get them done. Whereas if you have 2 tasks, you're like, I can nail these. I can give them the highest quality ever. So I think sometimes people get so carried away with volume to the effect that their quality goes down. And by quality, I mean like their intent within lifts, their proximity to failure, their technique, all those factors that actually lead to a better stimulus. So they're going about getting a stimulus in a really inefficient way, having to do lots of sets, which all accumulate fatigue that could have been done in less. So you kind of have to make sure with your clients that you're not giving them just volume for the sake of, oh, I feel recovered, I feel great. It's like, well, you're clearly not very good at disrupting that muscle and kind of causing a stimulus and fatigue within that muscle if you're needing so much. And that might just be down to you not having the skill down. But if we give you too much work to do, you can't perfect that skill either. So I do think people just in general are too happy to just add more volume. And I can see why, because quite clearly the literature came out where there's a dose response
Yeah.
between volume and hypertrophy. So it was like, more, give me more. And the clients want more, we want more. And I fell into that trap myself as like a trainee, where I was just like, yeah, more is better. But I certainly got into that position where I had so many sets. By the end, I was like, man, I can't actually push myself to my limit on every set, because how the hell am I going to do that on 5 sets of like a deadlift? Like, it's not going to happen. Now for me, it's like 2, and I'm like pretty damn cooked. Maybe I can do a third. So I do think there is that, the chat coming back to like versus volume, and viewing it more as a stimulus that we're trying to achieve, and then getting that feedback from the client can be really helpful there. So yeah, I just think that in theory doesn't always work out in practice,
Sure.
and that can lead people down the wrong route when they just look at science and they're not listening to what's happening in the real world, whether that's with themselves or with a client in question.
Yeah. Okay. So some really good points there, actually. I think I made some notes as you're going through there. So first of all, we were talking earlier, we were talking about kind of evidence-based coaching and training, and that kind of term gets very thrown around. And I agree on that. I think I mean, evidence is evidence, statistics are statistics, facts are facts. I'm not saying, hey, you know what, start doing your own thing. I do think people take things so literally that they start to kind of almost not apply to human beings. Like they take, oh, this is it. Every human being is the same. I have this saying with my clients that what is optimal on paper isn't always necessarily optimal for the client. And that's a really important thing. So you might have something that's the most optimal quad exercise on earth. They might find tomorrow, they go, actually, there's this secret movement that no human has ever done before. And you do it once and your quads are just going to double in size. But if a client fucking hates doing it every time they do it, and it's just the most agonizing thing that they won't ever do, that's not very optimal for that client because they're not showing up and they're not doing that movement. So there is a level of kind of working with what's evidence-based, but there's also a level of working with, you know, what works for my clients, what are they actually going to do, what they're going to show up and be consistent with. So that's point number one. Point number two was kind of about the stimulus. So this is something that, again, I think I said this the other day on a different podcast, but I don't know if I came up with this. I'm going to say I have because it sounds better, or I've heard this somewhere else and I've just coined it as my own thing. But progressive stimulus is what I now look for within training and for clients, right? So instead of it being a case of progressive overload and you're looking to increase weight or reps all the time, there's other ways that you can increase that stimulus, and you could stay at the same weight and same amount of reps and get a better training session one week compared to another, just from, you know, the tempo you're moving at, moving with more intent, creating a better kind of connection when you're lifting that weight instead of, you know, maybe bringing in other muscle groups to help out. So for example, it could be on a bench press, instead of letting your sort of delts take over so much, you could really focus on getting that pec working as much as it possibly can. It could be the skill of how, so that's like the skill of how you do the movement. It can be, you know, the, did I say time and attention? Anything like that, that really is involved in creating a better stimulus, you can really utilize to your best ability. And I think that is almost sometimes forgotten at the expense of seeing weight go up or reps go up. And I get it, because if you're more into training, you find it more interesting, you're a little bit more in the world of kind of, you know, what's actually going on, how things work, how to get the most effective training out, you're probably more happy to do things that aren't, you know, overtly so, what's the best way of saying this? They don't create such a clear gain from what you've done. So for example, if you go into the gym one week and you lift heavier weights than the week previously, you can see on paper, I've lifted 5 kilos or 10 kilos more than I lifted the week before. Fantastic. You've got a little bit of kind of a buzz there. And I think for less skilled individuals, less skilled clients, perhaps more general pop, they really get a buzz off that stuff. And that's the thing that keeps them kind of showing up little wins week on week. If you are more skilled, you probably understand that actually, even though the weight didn't go up one week or the reps didn't maybe go up one week, if you performed a movement better, inherently that's going to be better for you long term, because you're going to increase your skill level and increase the stimulus that's happening within the muscle. So there's, you know, if you're going in and doing just a dog shit form squat and then go in the following week and do a better quality squat, well, you probably haven't earned the right to increase the weight or the reps anyway. So that inherently has a better, you know, stimulus for you and is better for you long term. So I think when I talk about progressive stimulus, for me, it's a little bit more about kind of almost earning the right to increase the weight or the reps. It is very hard put into practice because all of us have an ego to some extent, and going into the gym and kind of just maybe having a bit of a ego check and go and dropping the weights can be difficult at times. Like, I mean, even last week I did it on one of the movements that we've been working with for a while. And I was like, you know what, the form on this just isn't, it's just not good enough. And all I'm doing is kind of, you know, stroking my own ego here. If I drop this, I'm actually going to get more out of it, and drop the weight and actually came off way sorer than I normally would have been because I'm training that muscle more effectively. So looking at progressive stimulus is a huge thing there. And I think the other thing with regards to volume, it's all about getting the most from the least. If you can get more sort of effective training out of less work and less volume and less, you know, reps, less sets, whatever it is, you're going to be able to have a bigger runway to be able to kind of grow muscle tissue, for example. So you might have a training block. If you go out week one and you train to failure week one, and every week you train to absolute failure, like literally like gun to your head, someone's going to shoot you if you literally could have done half a rep more. what you end up doing is your training block's actually a lot shorter because you build up so much fatigue during that initial bit of training that it's not really that effective for you long term. Whereas if you go into it and you work with, what's the least amount of work that I need to do to be able to get some, the most amount of muscle growth I can get, that training block, that mesocycle is going to be a lot longer because you don't build up so much fatigue. And I think this is something that I've seen you talk about. Obviously, Mike Israetel talks about this a lot, is that kind of um, fatigue versus stimulus, right? And what the kind of ratio between those two things is. If you're programming for clients and you feel like they're training relatively effectively, you shouldn't be training to failure straight away in the first weeks. You should be really kind of working with, 3 to 4 reps in reserve and then sort of building that up as you get towards the end of the block and training more to failure towards the end of the block. I think the issue comes in here is where you have, again, less skilled individuals. They maybe don't know what failure is as much. And again, even more skilled individuals probably don't have, like, a lot of people, like, I know maybe my idea of failure can, vary a little bit here and there week on week. And that's just, I think we all have a little bit of error within us. That's going to be, you go in one week and you feel better than you did the week before. You got a better mindset than you did the week before. You had more energy. You train at a different time of day, whatever it is. You might squeeze out one more rep than you did the week prior that you should have got, or whatever it is. I think when you're programming for Gen Pop, that's where maybe you do, again, push the volume up maybe a little bit. Maybe you do push the how close people to get to failure up a little bit, because their perception of what failure is probably a lot lower than it is. So where do you sit on that kind of, maybe a bit of a spectrum there? What do you sit on that kind of spectrum of, let's say skill level versus the amount of volume and work you might give people based off kind of some of those factors?
Yeah, it's a interesting topic because I do see your point behind people who haven't been training as long. They haven't got the experience, and it's even been shown in research. People who don't have a lot of training experience, they are terrible at
Yeah.
knowing how many reps they have in reserve. Like, I think the average is like between 5 and 7 reps more they could have done where they thought they were at failure. It's like, man,
Yeah.
you're really freaking far away from failure. You'd have to do so much unnecessary volume to try and equate a stimulus.
Mm.
So then for them, it's like, well, yeah, you've got to kind of make sure they're pushing hard enough. But I also think you have to be careful because it's something we've talked about too, is like not letting technique break down. And because they're
Yes.
not skilled, you kind of therefore want to use like a technical failure point, I would say, for them. They might be further away from like that true muscle groups failure. But if they're hitting technical failure, you don't want to keep pushing them past that because they could
No.
cause themselves an injury. So I think that's a good idea to kind of work with more kind of novice trainees to kind of push them to a point where you're like, right, if your technique is starting to not look so good, that's where you kind of close it down. And as they get more skilled, they'll be better at actually taking the muscle group that they're training within that lift to failure because they know how to orient themselves and stay switched on and just recruit more muscle fibers and everything like that, which is then what the more skilled person is doing. And because they're so skilled, again, this has been shown in research, people with more training experience, they're actually very good at knowing their RAR. In fact, like you said, like being a 1 RAR off is like a lot of advanced trainees at the point where they can call it within 1 rep, especially in lower repetition ranges. So I think for them, they definitely can afford to stay further from failure and accumulate some good stimulus week to week
Yeah.
and use the benefit of what the deload's done for them. That's reduced fatigue, it's resensitized them a little bit. So now they can meet a minimum threshold, like you said, for growth, not shoot for maximum, because otherwise, if they shoot for the maximum, like you said, they're going to be sore all over, they're going to be beat up. Next week, progression is going to go downwards, whereas they can just meet the threshold for overload for hypertrophy, and then each week they can just add a little bit, and keep moving along and seeing that progressive stimulus throughout the session. Whereas, yeah, like you said, for the more novice person that you're coaching, you probably can allow them to push to that point of like almost like where their technique just feels like it maybe is just drifted from where it should. And once they've got that skill down for technique, then they're in a position where they can start thinking more about, all right, let's push this to failure. Let's experience what maybe a 0 reps in reserve feels like
Yeah.
on a squat pattern. And then they can be like, oh, now I know I've got my logbook data. Now I can use that to inform my next training cycle. I can come out the gates where I'm thinking I'm in the good spot. And then I'll learn because I'll keep trying to progress things over the weeks as we come. If I can go for 10 weeks, I probably sandbagged it potentially at the start. But if I can go for 3, I maybe went out the gates too hard. And after a few times doing that, you get into a really good position, especially when you come accustomed to what a stimulus kind of gauge feels like you
Yeah.
mentioned. you kind of improved your technique with lower loads, but you felt like that disruption the next day with that soreness, which is just a sign that you've kind of put in really good work for that muscle group. So yeah, lots to say on all the points you said there, but we probably don't have time.
Yeah, no, I think there's a lot in there. And I think the other thing, I don't know if you've seen this lately, but there's been a lot of stuff on, maybe it's just because I've gone down the rabbit hole and now I'm getting it kind of shot at me, but
Feed.
yeah, my feed. But I don't know if you've seen a lot of like people now uh, are saying that you should be doing, they're calling them like dailies, right? So if you've got a muscle group that isn't responding, it could be your arms, it could be your delts, it could be your abs, just doing a small amount of work, but doing it every single day. And I don't know what I would call this, but I kind of see it as like, maybe I'll call it like the lumberjack effect, right? If you go and do a job like a lumberjack, you probably see within a month, like your forearms blow up, your probably neck and traps will get a lot thicker. You probably see a lot of muscles that are getting used for that kind of work grow in a lot of size because you're using them every single day, but you're not kind of training them close to failure to the point where it's like, causing so much muscle damage in that sense. It's a different style of training. What do you think about something like that where someone could come in and it's maybe not something that's even been that studied in the sense of maybe growing muscle tissue. Maybe it is, I don't know if it's been studied in kind of rehabilitation or something like that. But there is, I suppose, this could be a little bit of bro science from my end, but potentially I wonder if there's any effect and any kind of benefit from doing something that is, if your arms aren't responding, doing just like a set, like 5 minutes of like bicep curls every day, not to complete failure, but just a little bit of work. And would your body respond? Have you seen
Yeah.
anything that's along those lines? What's your thoughts there?
I haven't heard of it, and now I want to find who's
It's
saying
interesting.
this.
Yeah.
I think I personally think it's incredibly arbitrary, like
Mhm.
dailies. Like, oh, my arms aren't responding. The first thing I'm going to go to is train them daily. I'm like, well, how's your technique? How's your intent? I'd be looking at these. Are you using exercises that are actually effective for you? I'd be looking at all those things. How's your training? How's your nutrition? Like, assuming all of that stuff is right, then
Yeah.
I'd move to, okay, what are we doing now? How much volume are you doing? How many days are you doing? If you're currently doing 10 sets at the end of all your kind of pull sessions, maybe move those set of like 5 after both 2 pull sessions or something. Maybe move arms first in the session, prioritize them a little bit, see if they start growing that way. I'd start slowly moving them towards what could end up being daily. So for me,
Yeah.
like my abs and calves, arguably I could move to a daily approach. I train them 4 days a week. They're never sore. They're never very overly fatigued. I could probably increase the training frequency, and I could probably therefore increase my training volume, and that would probably be okay. But then you have to realize, like, you can't just add on top of what you've already got. Maybe that takes away from somewhere else. Do I want
Yeah.
to emphasize my calves and abs for the detriment of other muscle groups? Probably not. That's probably a concern for a more advanced trainee, but that's probably the person that's considering this sort of thing anyway,
Yeah.
where they're not seeing the thing respond. So I'd certainly start with, like, are you doing all the basics right? I'd then look at how much you're doing now. Let's see if we can just prioritize what you're doing now. And then I'd move to a case of, okay, you're recovering from what you're doing now. Could we do a little bit more? Maybe then we can increase the frequency. And then like the next step, I certainly wouldn't go from like training my arms twice a day. Sorry, twice a week, twice a
Yeah.
day, twice a week to twice a day. No, to every single day. I think it's an extreme jump, and yeah, people are going to see results from that potentially, but they're also putting them at chance of like overdoing it and seeing worse results, especially if they like barely needed any more from what they were doing, and then they suddenly go to daily. Suddenly, you can do too much volume, like we've spoken about before, to the point of which now maybe they're seeing diminishing returns, or it could also take away from other training if they're not careful about it. Where if those muscle groups are now getting really, really sore and beat up, it's now impacting other things, especially if they haven't like pulled volume away from something else. Now this is becoming a priority. So yeah, that's where my kind of thoughts go. It sounds it's I the fact it's got the name dailies, I'm sold on it. It sounds really cool, but I'm like, that's not the way I would go about I'd go about a systematic way of identifying what do we need to do to start seeing growth, and then go from there, and rather than like jumping from one thing to another.
Yeah, so I think with a lot of that as well, there's definitely, like you said there, there's a element of, okay, is this actually going to detract from the rest of my training? That's a big thing there. But I do also like the idea of that there's a kind of there's a lot of things maybe that need more research in and need looking at more. This is definitely something that I doubt has even been looked into. So it'd be very interesting if someone just did a study on it just to see, even if it was just like, yeah, it's a fucking stupid idea. But I do also kind of think sometimes, like, again, very bro sciencey, but if you went into a job and you had to do that and you were training anyway, I feel like your body would adapt very well at some point. Like you just have to kind of adapt, right? But then is that a case that you would adjust your training outside of that? And that's probably likely what is more likely to happen. So it's interesting, but I like seeing a lot of the things on TikTok that are kind of TikTok's where I go to now for seeing what's the newest trend, what's the
Yeah.
newest thing. And I always get very, very kind of, I go down a bit of a rabbit hole, which are kind of like, there's a few things here that I want to kind of branch off onto, but let's go back to something you just said earlier on, very briefly. But you mentioned about genetics, and you mentioned about kind of, you said, maybe you don't even feel like you've got the best genetics in the world. Um, to what extent do you feel like genetics impact your ability to get to the end goal? For most people, they don't want to be bodybuilders, right? So to what extent, like I already know your answer on this, but I think it'd be interesting for other people listening. To what extent do you feel like genetics play a role in getting to where you want to be? And to what extent do you feel like, actually, you know what, just suck it up, put the work in, and kind of just play the cards you've been dealt with, and do what you can to achieve what you want to achieve?
Yeah, it's a subject that's quite close to me because I see people online and they're like, "Oh, it's not genetics, it's all hard work." And quite often these are like genetic freaks who are like deadlifting double what you could ever imagine you could
Yeah.
deadlift. And they're 16 years old or something. And you're just like, dude, come on. I've been doing this over double the time you have. I've thought about it way harder than you have. And I'm unfortunately never going to look like the way you look. And then you get other people on the other end of the spectrum where they're like, it's all genetics. It doesn't matter what you do. Like, if you're like bound to not be a natural pro bodybuilder, you'll never be one. It's like, well, no, like that's also not true because there could be plenty of guys who could have gone maybe pro as a natural bodybuilder. I even refer, like, I have a best friend and he is definitely more made for bodybuilding than I am. When we used to train together, he would just like grow like a weed. He has nice small joints, like a nice sweeping lats.
Yeah.
Like he looked great. He doesn't care about bodybuilding. He doesn't put any effort into that. He's just a builder actually. So it's like I have way more muscle than he has, but arguably he would have better genetics. So genetics have a huge, huge role. Anyone who's top of the top, they have the best genetics in the world, like without a doubt. Like if you're looking at like any of the top Olympia competitors, any of the top natural bodybuilders, you look at any of the top just like Olympic athletes, they all have the best genetics in the world. But that's combined with hard work. You get the best of both worlds when you combine those two together. They're the top of the top, and then everyone else is somewhere in between around that. So if we talk about like for can you get to your goal, everyone can improve upon where they are, even within research, like the number of like non-responders. It's like, are they non-responders or did we just not give them the program that they need? Talking about volume, interestingly, a lot of non-responders to some of the programs seem to respond when you give them enough. It's like
Yeah.
they're like a hard gainer. You just have to give them so much freaking work and they eventually meet the threshold. It's just they have to work way harder than the other people to see results. And so most people are going to be able to improve where they are from today. I remember my goal, I don't know who, if you had a goal like this, Jack, but I had a goal of looking like Mark Wahlberg.
Yes, that's a
You
good goal.
remember
Yeah, yeah.
his Calvin Klein adverts. I was like, man, this guy is like lovely abs, like really nice broad shoulders, small waist, like good amount of muscle, but not crazy. He was like my goal. And I certainly have more muscle mass than him now. Not to sound too arrogant, but I would hope I would by now. But I didn't for the longest time. And I don't look like him. Like I don't have a nice small waist like him. I don't have nice abs like him. I don't have the like as broad shoulders. I'm just never going to look like him. So if you have someone as a person who's your goal, I moved from Mark Wahlberg to Matt Ogus, who, if you ever Google him, like again, he looks incredible. If you know Chris Elkins, have you heard that name?
No, I haven't heard Chris
Any,
Elkin.
but again, another example of just someone like both Chris and Matt are relatively short, so
Yeah.
they've got a lot of muscle on their frame, but they look really big in photos in particular. But in real life, they look amazing, like
So short,
unclothed, because
how
they're
annoying.
natural. Yeah, I know. They call themselves manlets for that reason. But like both with really symmetrical abs, like really chunky shoulders, like big chest, small waist,
Sure.
sweeping quads. And I just don't have the muscle insertions, the muscle bellies, the bone structure, all of those elements are they're just out of my hands. Like I don't have any control on that. Like you said, they're the cards I was dealt with, but now I can play as smart as possible. I can learn as good as possible. I can make sure that I'm getting sufficient sleep, doing my nutrition as well as I can, training hard in the gym, being smart
Yeah.
about stuff. So this is where like your self-efficacy comes in and where you can put that hard work. It's always that like hard work versus talent. And that saying is like hard work beats talent when talent doesn't work hard. And that can happen. I've certainly beaten bodybuilders on stage who arguably be a better genetics than me, but I've come in leaner, I've come in crisper because I'm more potentially dedicated to the process. Maybe there's some genetic influence to how hard you want to work. Like, it's actually interesting. I think they looked at, because I did a presentation on genetics, they looked at like huskies, and huskies, the dog get a real reward from like working and
Yeah.
pushing all the time. And there might be some people that get like a reward response from the board. Like you said, bodybuilding is often boring, consistent things, basic over time. Some people probably love that. Other people maybe hate it. And that could influence even results. So yeah, the way I look at it, like you kind of said, and what the answer you're probably knowing I'd end on is genetics are super important. They influence everything. You have no control over them though. So you do have control over other elements of what you're doing. So focus on those things, focus on the process, and you'll get to the best outcome you could possibly hope for. If you keep focusing on what you don't have, like you just will not focus on what you need to be focusing on to get the best result that you could possibly get.
Absolutely. And I think, again, if you're worrying about your genetics, you're worrying about the wrong thing because you physically cannot change those things unless you get some kind of
Not
CRISPR
yet.
therapy. Not yet. Maybe one day we'll be able to do it, but it'll just be like some kind of super race of superhumans just walking around just jacked and just chiseled. But yeah, I think as well, like even on the bodybuilding side of things, it's like, okay, cool. Bodybuilding is very much a sport of who can be the most boring, isn't it? Like who can just kind of do the same thing over and over and over again and just stick with it and be consistent with it. I think they're really important things. And you mentioned something else before when you were talking about that was kind of even like the genetic effort of what you put in, right? Is there a benefit? Are you more genetically gifted than someone else in terms of the work capacity you have or what your um, tolerance to just boredom is, or like being able to do
Discomfort.
things that you
Yeah.
don't want to do, discomfort? Have you got a higher pain threshold than someone else? Are you genetically wired to have like a better, like, yeah, response or reward from the hard work you're putting in? Like you use the example of huskies there, but even if we just look at testosterone, right? Testosterone is very much a hormone which there's loads of studies that show, like, if you are surrounded in like a competitive environment, maybe you're a man and you're in an environment where there's a lot of other men in a very competitive field, your testosterone is higher. If you get a win or you do something that is kind of considered by you as like succeeding in something, your testosterone increases. So there's very much like, okay, are you getting a better dose response from something? Or are you getting more of a reward from your body when you do something hard, or you complete something over and over again, or you win at something? Are you getting more of a reward there? And that may even happen just on a day by day basis of getting your training done. Are you just getting that tiny micro little bit more than someone else? That could be something that carries you to, the outcome you want in a more favorable outcome, more favorable position with better results than the other person who's got more kind of obvious genetic benefits. I think it'd be very naive to assume that genetics only play a role on your muscle bellies and muscle insertions and how strong you are, kind of thing. It makes up everything that you are and who you are. And I think there's a huge role in that. I do believe there is a huge element of nurture, and like you can be born with shit genetics, but end of the day, like you could be born with the worst genetics in the world. You're not changing it. So you may as well work on the things that you can control that are going to get you the outcomes that you want to achieve. If you do that, you typically do, like you say, what is it? Hard work beats talent when talent doesn't work hard. True every time, because if you're talented, if you're amazingly talented and you're born with all this skill that was just naturally given to you, if you believe in that, I guess there's a bit of an argument on whether that is even the case. But if you don't use it, then what? There's nothing there. It's like someone being born, like if someone was born today and they have the genetics to be the world's best basketball player who's ever lived and whoever will live, but they just want to be an accountant. Well,
Yeah.
it doesn't work kind of on that front. So I think there's a huge amount of kind of scope to look at within genetics and how that can work. And especially when you're looking at your clients. So if you're trying to bring this around to where your clients are, I think what I wanted to kind of move into on this was, let's say you've got clients that have things that aren't responded as much. And you kind of touched on this before, was like, if you give people enough work at some point, something, your body's very good at adapting. So maybe they've just got a high tolerance or threshold to see the changes. And I think, a good way of looking at this is maybe looking at kind of your minimum effective dose, your sort of adaptive volume, your maximum adaptive volume, right? Is um, minimum of sort of effective volume, sorry. Is using that maybe a little bit more to your advantage. Everyone's going to be at a different level in that spectrum. My kind of minimum effective dose for lateral delta is going to be different to yours, right? And that's going to be different to someone else who does like 3 sets a week and they just fucking blow up out of nowhere and they're just like, delta's are really easy to grow. I think it's very easy as a coach. You can almost have a bias towards what your genetics allow you to do and what you're good at naturally. If you were going into sort of, let's say you were trying to teach someone how to do programming and you wanted to consider that fact in and say, look, if you've got clients who aren't responding in certain areas, despite what you respond well to, what would be your best advice to someone who's trying to program to get kind of really good results at their clients with that fact taken into account?
Yeah, it's a great question because, yeah, I think there's, as a coach, what you do inherently does bias, like then how you coach others, because
Yes.
how couldn't it? Because everything in your life biases your kind of perception on things. But then if you are careful not to individualize and take what's happening in front of you with your client, even if it feels wrong, like, I don't know, maybe you need 5 sets to grow your quads, but they need 15 or 20 to seemingly get there. If you keep them at 5, they're never going to grow them. And so you have to listen to what's happening for them in practice. So the way I kind of look at this is, even for myself, this is the way I go about it, is kind of have that consultation with the client, get an understanding of what their background is with training, what it's looking like, maybe even get their previous training plan that they were doing, get an understanding of how much training volume they were putting through themselves, and if that was working for them. Then taking consideration kind of, and this is where evidence-based and the scientific
Yeah.
literature can be great because it's a starting point. And like, as you'll hear, most people quote 10 to 20 sets per muscle group per week seems to be this kind of range where you're going to get the most hypertrophy. So it's like, okay, let's start with the low end of that because we can always add. We don't really want to be taking away because it's just not as comfortable a position to be in. So maybe you're looking at about, okay, 10 sets per muscle group per week. And that's including, a lot of people don't remember this, but it's like the for every pulling movement that counts as a set to your biceps, for example. You don't need
Yeah.
so you don't need much for your biceps towards the end, potentially. So you start with like that baseline, start with where they're coming from. So if they're currently doing like, 15 sets for their quads, you were thinking 10, maybe you go somewhere in the middle to just kind of start them there and then program for them. Make sure they're getting all the basics right. So you look at their technique, look at their intent within the session, make sure that they're not sandbagging or leaving like half their range of motion there, get their quality there in place, and then look at their progression. First of all, most important thing is that objective data is how they're progressing week to week. Is that going well? Maybe you've hit the jackpot, like you can just keep it where it is. You don't need to change it. If they're like struggling and it isn't going how you expect, or even regressing, maybe you started out with too much. In that case, depends if they're recovering or not. So if they're if progression isn't going how you would like it to go, you can look at, okay, are they recovering or are they not recovering? If they're saying, oh, I've always got overlapping soreness, or like I come into every session, I'm feeling super fatigued, then clearly they're not recovering. You need to bring things back. If they're like, I feel like I never train my quads, then you probably want to increase the amount that they're doing and then see how they're going. So I use, and you'll know this, Jack, in my spreadsheets, like a readiness score for
Yeah.
each exercise that you're coming to. So you can say, are you fresh? Are you okay? Or are you fatigued? And so then I had that kind of, okay, are they recovering between sessions and how's that amount of volume that they're working with in terms of readiness? So I can then look at stimulus is something I look at, and I go from minimal all the way through to high. Minimal is like, I don't feel like I train that muscle group. And so that gives me a clear sign, like, and when I get people to think about stimulus, this is something you have to like have some experience with. And luckily a lot of my clients are well experienced in the gym, but also I try and educate it in terms of, is it getting a pump? Does it feel tired in the local musculature? Does it feel tight potentially? Is it like quivering? Those sort of things really help. And as you kind of think about them, it helps more and more. Are you getting a metabolite buildup? Is it sore
Mhm.
the next day? That can inform your stimulus side. So if people are like, I'm fresh, I've got minimal stimulus, and their quality is there, they're training hard, and their technique is good, you can be like, right, they probably need more. And I have a client like this, and I'm always shocked at how much volume he needs. And I'm like, are you sure? Like, you need another set here? He's like, and I'm watching his sets. I'm like, damn, this guy trains like his ass off. Like, I
Yeah.
wish I don't wish this upon him, but if I held him back, I'd just be not letting him get the results he needs. Whereas if you've got someone who's like fatigued and they're like high in terms of stimulus, they're like, well, maybe we need to scale this back. They've always got hamstrings is one that I sometimes get with clients where they literally need like a set of RDLs and they're sore for 2 days.
Yeah.
So I'm like, geez, all right. Okay, so maybe we'll do one set of RDLs and 2 sets of lying leg curls, and that will get you all we need. And they never need to progress that set volume. Like, it's always providing them enough within that range. So those are some of the ways, kind of starting with where are they coming from? What does scientific literature say? That gives us a baseline. Look at how they're responding in terms of their progression in the gym, their recovery, and then also the stimulus that they're feeling. And that gives you the feedback to move them from, like you mentioned, that minimum effective volume, work through maximal adaptive volume, and then eventually you're going to hit a wall where you're fucked.
Yeah.
And basically you're like, the best I could do next week is repeat this performance, or I'd maybe regress. Let's deload and then rinse and repeat and go from there.
Yeah. It's kind of almost like it's like a law of diminishing returns. Like you can get so much and then you sort of add in more and more starts to almost take like less
Yeah.
benefit. And then you will probably go too far where you start to actually see breakdown and recovery starts getting affected in there. And they're huge things as well. I think another thing you'd mentioned there was about kind of looking at what the literature says is obviously a really good one to start with, but then also looking at what is the client actually doing. And again, that maybe comes back to where the skill is. Like this is where that making sure that you don't have a bias in what you're doing. What works for you and what the literature says is probably where a lot of your bias may come from. But that doesn't necessarily mean that that's probably best for that client. Equally, you need to understand that maybe that client isn't training as effectively as they could be training. So if they're putting a lot of work into something, you might go, oh man, this person needs like tons of work on their hamstrings compared to everyone else. Might be even worth just getting a form video over. So obviously in the world of like online coaching, it's a little bit harder to check form, but it's not impossible. You can get some videos over a few different angles. If you can look at kind of rep speed, you can see, mostly where people are moving, you can make a very good judgment. I would say it's 95% as effective as if you were there in person kind of thing. So where that comes to play in, I think, is if you do find that actually maybe someone is falling outside of what you maybe typically see, doesn't mean that it's not true. But what you may need to do is just kind of assess and go, okay, what else is at play here? Is there something that's maybe not being done effectively that's causing us to artificially bump up the needs here, to bump up your requirements here? It's very similar to like, let's say you've got clients who just their nutrition just is never ever like even vaguely on point. Like you've got some people who there's a little bit of variance, cool. But there's some people who just week on week are just miles over, but they track as if they are completely on point. And you go, okay, cool. What's happening here? Well, I think the reality of the situation is that you can work loads and loads at trying to get the adherence. Well, you can work loads to get the adherence up. You can work loads to get the accuracy up. But at the end of the day, there comes a point where you've almost got to play the client at their own game. So if you've tried every tool in the toolbox, you've done everything you can, and they're still not adhering there, at some point you've kind of got to take that in. You've got to take the reins in your own hands kind of thing and work with what you're being given. So I think there's a level of doing that with your training and also your nutrition with clients. And again, I think this typically would come in more with less skilled individuals, because if you're more skilled, you understand things and the reasoning behind things, you're probably going to be a bit more on point with it. But you can do it with nutrition where you go, okay, cool. This person is consistently over by 400 calories. I almost have to give them 300 to 400 calories less than they need, so that when they do track it and eat it, they're actually going into the range of calories they would be in. Obviously, that's a last resource, and that's not what you want to kind of rely on. But for the most part, I think there is a level of kind of playing people at their own game. And you can kind of almost do that with training as well. As if you're finding that requirements are a lot higher, there is a level of trying to bring accuracy up, skill levels up, and things like that. But there might be a point where you kind of go, okay, cool. This person just has a mental block on going anywhere near failure. Maybe I need to just kind of bump the volume up to get like just a little bit more out of this, or work with what you're being given. I personally don't see too much of an issue with that. But I know some coaches who would go, oh, that's a bit like unethical to do that. What's your
Sure.
thoughts on that?
Yeah, I guess my initial thought is I always try and meet the client where they are at and give them a
Hmm.
really honest just discussion. So it's
Yeah,
like that example where you're like, you look at everything and you're like, this person should be losing on this intake. And there's simply, I am almost certain they're not adhering. I won't assume they're not adhering. I will just
yeah,
lay it out with them and be like, this is what I'm thinking. Like, are you being completely honest with me? Because otherwise, we're going to have to drop your calories further. And that makes me a bit uncomfortable because I think it's a bit lower than maybe we need to.
yeah,
And that might just give them the opportunity to be like, you know what, Steve, I've been like, my adherence is not as good as what I'm putting in here. Like, I'll tighten things up. Let's get that going. Other times they might come back and be like, again, they could lie to you. And then you're in a situation, like you said, fuck it. Like they want results, like bring the calories down. Like
mhm,
it isn't going to be like you are, like you're achieving the same outcome either way. Like if they're overeating and you reduce them, they're still getting to the calorie goal, but you're kind of trying to target them there. And sometimes you get weird like situations where clients really need way less or more calories than you ever would have thought they need. But
sure.
I've had it both ways where I'm like, female client needing like 4,000 calories. I'm like, do you really need this many? Or am
Yeah,
I pushing up your calories? And you're like, oh, maybe I'll go to 3,000 when he says 4,000, something like
yeah,
that. But equally on the way down, I've had it the same way where I'm like, are you truly tracking like your milk in your coffee and the sugar you add and like that biscuit that Sandra gave you? And I'm like, "No, I don't think you are, but okay, I'll listen to you here." And then with training, the same way, like you can't, like you mentioned, when you're not one on one with someone, like you can look at their form, but if they ever can't, like you can say, I think you've got more in the tank, keep pushing. But if they're like, no, I don't have more in the tank, like they think they've hit failure, they can't push any harder. It's not like you can be there and like be like, no, keep going. You can encourage them and push them. They have to do that work on their own in the gym. So in that case, you can use the scientific literature because it seems that if you at least get like in the proximity to failure, like you said, 3, 4 RER, you are meeting the threshold that's stressful enough for them to see adaptations. So if you can give them enough work, they can almost make up for the intensity lost through volume. But they need to at least keep working in that threshold. If they start really sandbagging, then you're just like, man, now you're just going through the motions, and you're not going to see results unless you really start like pushing yourself harder. And then you might use things like, right, let's get you on a machine press because you'll feel more confident to fail on that or push harder
sure.
in that. Let's use like safer lifts where you're more confident to do it. Can you work with a training partner or something? Or for that sort of person, it might be worth just referring them to a one-on-one PT or something that can deal with them there.
So I think something you said there was quite interesting was, if you've, let's say you've got someone who's just like, oh, I can't push any further with training, right? Um, a lot of time we talk about technical failure or, mechanical failure where, you just literally can't move anymore, right? Um, but I think there is an element of like psychological failure that also plays a role that's kind of again, I would say that again, probably for less skilled individuals. And that's not like to say that they're not able to push through it. I think it takes a bit of a learning curve to kind of go, oh, actually, I can go further than this pain. But you have to kind of experience it a few times before then you go, oh, fuck, this is painful, but I can go through it. And even then, maybe coming back to that whole genetics point, what's your just natural pain tolerance? Do you have a higher pain tolerance than someone else? For someone where actually, if you had gun to your head, we'll shoot you in the head if you don't do the reps until complete failure. Maybe they could get like 5, 6 more reps out of it, but in their head, that is just the most pain they can tolerate. They're like, I literally cannot do anything without this being the most agonizing thing in the world, at least in that split second. It always happens. I think we were talking about this earlier, actually, is like or the other day was on the leg extension when you get to the last few reps and you're just kind of like, ah, God. And you always
They
get out
hurt.
kind of wriggling around, just like holding your legs. You always look like a madman. But yeah, I think there's an element of like psychological failure that is within training. And then within nutrition, I think you typically see maybe not so much. I suppose it is more. It's a psychological area or field that this is in. But the research on people who are, um, mistracking, secret eaters, secret bingers, the accuracy of people's like guesstimating is abysmal across the board, kind of thing. There's so many factors that kind of influence someone's nutrition that I think everyone already like pretty much inherently has a bit of a variance built into them. Like you said, it could just be like a splash of milk. To be honest, like for myself, I would never go and just like I have a bit of almond milk in a cup of tea. I probably am not going to like log that because I know it's like 10, 20 calories, but that can add up throughout the day, right? If you're doing that a lot of times, some people will look at that and go, okay, that's well, maybe once or twice. You probably maybe over by 40, 50 calories. But then you have other people who have less experience with nutrition. I've been tracking my food for years now. So I know where if something goes over a little bit, I probably get to the end of the day and I'll go, I was probably over by about 100 calories off stuff I didn't track. I'm going to eat 100 calories less and just round up, right? Other people don't have that skill level, but equally, they're because they don't have that skill level, the variance that maybe to UI might be 20 calories, 30 calories, 15 calories, to them is actually 60 calories or 100 calories every time they do it. And suddenly you do that 4 or 5 times in the day, you've just completely ruined an entire deficit. So I think there is an element of playing people at their game a little bit. And maybe I said that a little bit earlier, but I think the important thing is if you've done absolutely everything that you can do to increase skill level, to educate, to call someone out and say, hey, look, here's what's happening and here's what we would have to do. And I'm a big advocate of like, especially with nutrition, maybe saying, um, you know, hey, look, your nutrition's not been on point this week. Like, we need to get these results. And then I always find a really good way to go about this. So if you find that your clients aren't adhering to things and you find that your clients aren't doing the work they need to do, whether it's in nutrition, whether it's in their training, a really, really, really effective way to get them to show up, be more consistent, have better accuracy, and do the things that they need to be doing, essentially is to start you tracking all the data. This is why I really love apps, because you have it all in one place and you can very visually show things off. I think that makes it easier as well for Gen Pop. But if you track all the data, what that allows you to do is visually represent how accurate and consistent have you been. Human beings' brains are dog shit for looking at statistics and understanding statistics. We don't have that capacity to do it very well. But if you can visualize something and make it a lot easier for someone to look at and go, oh, there's a lot of red blocks there compared to green ones. You can very much show that to a client and say, can you expect, or do you expect to see the results you want to see from what the work that you're putting in, from the input that you're putting in? If you can visually show someone that, I find that that's a very effective way. So the way that I might do it is during a check-in process, I might do a Loom video to show off that client's check-in for the week. And I'll talk through the process of what they've been going through. I'll say, this is the goal that we're looking for. This is what it seems is happening. And here's the data that we have collected. This is objective data. If it's their steps that they're not being consistent with, you can show on a chart how many steps is that person consistently getting. If they're claiming to do 10,000 steps a day, but you can see it's 1,000 to 2,000 steps a day, it's very easy to say, hey, look, there's a lot of lines here where you're not getting even close to this. If it's their calories, you can do this on Trainerize, for example, which is really good. You can see it's a bar graph. You can see a lot of bars that are underneath the calories or way over the calories, or you can see a lot of days where there's no days tracked at all. And it makes it really easy for you to kind of almost switch the emphasis of what I'm doing isn't working and change the narrative more to, oh, I'm not actually putting in what I think I'm putting in. So I've got this theory I call it like the awareness action fallacy, right? I don't know if fallacy is the right word, but I'm calling it that for the sake of it. I believe that people inherently feel like they're doing more work than they think they are because they have brought awareness to a situation. So if you are someone who is struggling to lose weight, you're not enjoying how you look, how you feel, your confidence tanked and you just feel like shit all the time. You see this with like consultation forms and things like that. People will reach out and say, hey, I'd really like to get in contact with you about coaching. I want to get in shape. I want to sort of change myself. How do I know? Like, what can you tell me more about it? Can we have a consult call? Whatever it is. People inherently feel like they've done a lot more towards a problem or a situation because they've mentally brought awareness to it in their own head. So in other words, they have a higher tax or a higher bandwidth usage towards a problem than they normally have, because normally there's nothing. And suddenly they've taken a small bit of action, like filled out a consult form or had a conversation with you or just done a little bit of Googling about a nutrition plan or a training plan. And suddenly their expectation, because they've done so little, their baseline is so low, is they've had this huge spike and they feel like they've done fuck tons. And a lot of people can rely on that for another few weeks, few months, because they feel like they've done something active towards a problem. So coming back to what I was saying there with clients is a lot of the time, clients feel like they've done a lot more than they actually have because they're actively engaging in a coaching process. If you can visually show a client the statistics, the data of what they're actually putting in, and then turn the question on them and say, do you feel you can expect to see the results you want to see off off the work you're putting in, off the inputs that you're putting in, off of what we're showing here? A lot of the time the client then goes, oh yeah, shit, maybe not. Because they've got this kind of almost like heightened expectation of what they're putting in versus what's actually happening in reality. And you can bring attention to that and kind of almost solve that just by saying, hey, here's actually what's happening. Have you had a look at that? And suddenly they go, oh, I actually didn't think about that like that. Because all week they're thinking about nutrition. All week they're thinking about training. All week, even if they haven't done the training session, they've considered going to the gym and they've thought about the gym and they've gone, oh, I've got that training session I need to do later. So their mental tax for what they're doing is a hell of a lot higher than the actual inputs they're putting in. And I find a lot of the time that can often solve a lot of problems. Have you ever found with clients that maybe a more blunt approach with them and calling people out is sometimes the best approach? Because I know there can be a lot of ways where you can do that with some people and they get their backs up and then they disappear for 3 weeks. You're like, what the fuck, you can't.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
other people are very receptive to that and they go, oh yeah, shit, I thought it was, okay, yeah, no, you're right, kind of thing.
Yeah, I think I know the sort of situation you're talking about. I'm quite lucky in that the way I tend to kind of get clients, they've already got an awareness of kind of who I am,
Yeah.
what I'm like, my personality. And then we have the consult call. So they kind of know that too. So they already kind of have built that respect and trust for me where they know everything. And I might even say it to them again. And in their like startup video, when I send across a program, like everything we're doing or that I'm doing with you is nothing personal against you. It's just me being honest and I'm trying to help you get to your goals and uh, in the best way possible. So please don't like take personal offense to anything that I'm saying here. It's just like you can't expect to necessarily see what we're trying to see with what your current actions are. We need to see something better. And sometimes it can be a case of, and I always say this as well, where it's like the client will get as much out of coaching as they put into it. You'll get the clients who will miss a check-in every other week. They will barely fill out their spreadsheet, whatever it is. And you know that client is not going to see the results they should because without data, you're completely blind to what kind of changes
Yes.
you should be making as a coach. And without them really checking in, you don't really know what they're doing on their end. And you can't walk them like a dog, like around the program. And like, you can't make the meals for them. They have to do so much on their end. And we're really clear about that with our coaching. And I think every coach, like, it's sometimes a bit awkward for a coach to say it. Like, no, we actually need you to do a lot. Like, I'm not a magic maker.
Yeah.
Like, I think I made a post about like coaches aren't plumbers. Like, you can't call a coach and then suddenly give you like a six pack. Like, it's like you can call a plumber and they can fix your sink though.
I have used this analogy so
Oh,
fucking
have you?
often, and I'm so glad someone else has said it. Like, I always say, if you call a plumber, they show up to the house and they do the work. But if you are calling a coach and you say, I want to get in shape, they can only do like so much. And then it's like, there's
Yeah.
the stuff. It's kind of like calling a plumber and the plumber showing up and being like, here's the tools. I'm going to talk you
Yeah.
through how to do
Yeah.
this. And you going, right, is this right? And they go, yeah, just tighten that. Right. Now that's going to drain out. You're going to need something to catch it with. And then you going through that process. So yeah, I'm just got really excited about that. For
Yes. I didn't know you'd done that. Maybe I stole it from you without.
No.
without
That's I think that's
but
completely independent.
I'm sure lots of people have made that. Well, lots of coaches have probably thought a similar thing. But
Yeah.
yeah, I think some major coaches are afraid to do it because it makes coaching seem like it's hard work. But I've turned down clients where they're like, Steve, it sounds like I'm going to have to put in like quite a bit of work, like check in each week. And I'm like, well, maybe it'll take like 30 minutes, the whole check-in process, filling out your spreadsheet and stuff. But if you're already now concerned about how much work that might be for you,
Yeah.
I don't know if my coaching is going to be right for you because I do require input from you because this is a relationship. We aren't like you're the manager on the side of the pitch with your players on the field. Like you can help them, but you can't go on the field and kick the ball for them, sort of thing. You can't kind of win the game for them. So yeah, I very much kind of see where you're coming from with what you're talking about. I feel like I've forgotten what it is exactly, but for sure, I think sometimes as a coach, you have to have that And I'm not the sort of person, I'm not confrontational. I don't
Mhm.
generally have that sort of relationship with my clients. It's much more of a friendship.
Yeah.
And I think that works though, because now, then you can be like, dude, like you have screwed up here.
Mm.
You got to pull this in, tighten it up. Otherwise, we're not going to see what we want. And sometimes that can even lead you to another one of my clients. It's like you mentioned, he hadn't really seen the results he should have seen when he dieted for like 4 months, 5 months. It was like it was never really a burden for him. Like
Mhm.
he wasn't like experiencing lots of fatigue and like he wasn't complaining about hunger and things, but he wasn't really either seeing results. And I was like, dude, we've been at this for a while. I know you're not complaining about anything, but clearly it's not quite going how we wanted to. Let's just go into like a bit of a maintenance period. And he's been loving that. He was like, I didn't realize how much of a mental burden it was just thinking about being in a
Sure.
diet, even though he wasn't actually in a deficit for the like much of that
Yeah.
time. So, but yeah, you just have to like play with them. And I think that's where that coaching relationship comes in. You can't treat your clients just like robots and just like change macros and think that results are going to be spat out the other end. You get a few expected like clients like that now and then, but most of them are real humans with real lives and
Yes.
feelings and emotions. And you have to, therefore, that's where like personal trainers, I think it's going to be hard for like AI and stuff like that to take our job because people go to a personal trainer for that personal experience. Because even as a one-on-one PT, you remember back to like you PT someone and half of it's like a therapy session. It feels like
Yeah.
it's not. Then you're just there and there's someone that like they trust and they have fun talking to. But it's nice having that check-in point and keeping it personal to them.
What do you feel is the future of coaching with AI? Let's just delve into that very, very
Yeah,
quickly, because I think my opinion, and I'll maybe share my opinion very quickly, is I think AI will get incredibly, incredibly good at what it does, and I think coaching will be more so a little bit of a. It will be more of a situation where you are overseeing choices that AI makes. So you are basically saying yes or no to choices that AI makes. And I do think that you will step more into the role of, the human connection side of things. I think that's kind of where things are probably heading long term, because there's going to be technology that comes out that can make a probably more effective decision than you can based off of data with less bias and just goes, this is the best for the person based off of this huge plethora of data that we have from research and, other people who've gone through this method. It can make probably the best and most effective choice for that person. But equally, you have that human connection part and you can probably override the things where you say, I understand that's the best choice, but actually this client's really stressed out right now. And if we add that extra workout in, probably not the best thing to do.
I agree. I think it's going to weed out the coaches, and I'd almost put like coaches because they're not truly coaching someone through something. They're more just programming and they're more
Sure.
just number punching and they're more just like they're not actually getting a connection with that person. And because AI will be able to do all of that better than them. And even for someone like ourselves who are arguably skilled at like programming and doing all the nutritional side, again, like you said, AI can probably do that job potentially in the future even better based off like the top experts in the world programming it versus it getting like, I don't know, just part of programs from T Nation or something like a source like that actually get programmed by like the top trainers that can like know these things. And so yeah, I think it will still push people more to that personal perspective.
Yeah.
And the human element, the empathy that maybe the AI is just you're never going to get that like a robot going, oh, it's okay, don't worry, like versus. And I'm not saying that's necessarily what we do, but getting like a big thumbs up from a computer screen versus like a person who you know and trust and like you want to like almost please them in a sense because they're your coach, like that means so much more than like an AI just being like, I don't know, you hit your steps today like your watch does, whatever.
Yeah. Everyone needs to watch like Ex Machina and just understand that the AI will be very good at tricking us, and then all of a sudden it'll stab you in the back, take over. Just to round things up, and just kind of close up that last point we were talking about a little bit as well about kind of being, I suppose, as well with the AI stuff is creating that genuine connection with clients and how important that is. So, like creating a really strong connection with your clients really is important. Just outside of the training nutrition, I almost believe that a lot of coaches in theory could probably be a better coach, do better in business, achieve more results with their clients just from a better connection than someone who is just technically on the ball all the time.
Yeah.
Um, there's two things there. I think number one was you spoke about, some people just aren't that on the ball with everything and don't put things in. I think there is a lot of coaches who feel a bit of guilt towards, and I know I've spoken to coaches who feel a bit of imposter syndrome and a bit of guilt because they maybe aren't seeing the best results with all of their clients, right? So one thing I want to kind of really be clear with for coaches is that across the board, this is kind of a law of the universe, I suppose, that there is a bell curve in everything. Absolutely everything. You will have extremely high performing clients and you will have less high performing clients. And you will have the bulk of your clients sit somewhere in the middle where they're getting pretty good results, right? Your job as a coach and your job in the coaching and fitness industry, I personally believe, is to get better at your job and by shifting that bell curve to the right. So making it that you get slightly more high performers with a slightly better result, and that the bulk of your clients are getting slightly better results. And the lower end of that bell curve, that shifts more towards what previously was your kind of average result. And if you can shift that bell curve over time towards the right, I think that's kind of the best thing that you can aim to do. So when you're looking at your coaching, your training, your nutrition, your programming, how you work with clients, working with clients' psychology, understanding things, maybe it could be how your systems run. And when I talk about systems, I think maybe people sometimes get a bit confused. Systems to me just isn't just like technology and automations and stuff. It's thought processes and how you run through things and why you make certain decisions. If you can improve all those things over time, you naturally will shift that bell curve forward. So even your, clients who don't perform as best as they can, maybe because they don't gel with things, maybe you're not the best coach for them, whatever it is, you're always going to have these people. Like it's irrefutable that you would have these people. Even they get a half decent result. That's kind of what you're aiming for, is slowly moving that towards the point where you can kind of go, okay, they didn't get the best result possible, but they still got a pretty decent result. And I can walk away from this going, at least I put the best I could put into there. Huge thing within this, number one, is that interpersonal relationship that you can have with clients. And the second thing, I think a huge thing I talk about with my clients and the coaching team that I kind of teach about, that sort of delivery side of things and the psychology side of things, is the framing delivery. I think sometimes the way you frame things and the way you deliver things is actually more important than what you're typically saying. So it might be that you work with a certain type of client who you know that if you come forwards with them a little bit too blunt, they're just going to get their backs up. They might disappear for weeks and weeks. You've got to frame things in the right way. And I think where you said, like, kind of having a better relationship with your clients, being friends with your clients and having that sort of friendship almost, is a really positive thing. Because if you can deliver your coaching 90% of the time, 95% of the time, 99% of the time, you are being friendly, you're being firm with your points, you're not letting people walk all over you, but equally you're not being very blunt and you're having a bit of empathy in there. You get amazing results with clients, but equally it allows you to step in and be a little bit more blunt and a little bit more firm and just say, hey, look, I'm going to have to put my coaching hat on this week. We've had the last few weeks where this has happened, that's happened. We're not seeing the progress that you want to see. For you to be able to see these results, I need you to be doing this. If we don't go down that route, you're going to experience X, Y, Z. If we do make these changes, you're going to do this. But ultimately, right now, you're not doing what you need to do. And it allows you to be a little bit more blunt and a little bit more forwards with people, because their expectation of how you act and who you are as a coach and your relationship with them is always very consistent. If you frame it in the right way and you deliver it in the right way, you can be very forward and blunt with people on the lesser occasions, and they really respect it. They don't, a lot of people, I think a lot of coaches are a bit afraid of doing that because they're like, oh, my client's going to get pissed off with me. But actually they respect it a lot. They go, oh, okay, cool. You know what? Steve is actually generally all the time very friendly. He's all the time very helpful, really understands my situation. This week he's been a bit more forward with me. I can actually see, you know what? He's made some very good points. I can see why he's saying those things. I think that's a huge thing as well. So I think we've covered a lot today. And just to kind of round things up, I always like to ask people a little bit of I call it the elevator question, same as an elevator pitch. If someone says what they do for work, if you're an elevator and you've got to pass a little bit of very useful knowledge onto another coach, another PT, and you've only got an elevator ride to do it in, what is something that you think is very important and something that you would like to see changing in the fitness industry going forwards?
God, that's a question, isn't it? I'm going to just say what immediately comes to mind. And I think that's people are very often focused on things that are less important. So I would say they're more focused, often I see at least, people are more focused on acquiring new clients. They're more focused on acquiring more followers, more likes. They're more focused on their social media content and like profile and all those aspects and those numbers. Ultimately, the people like paying your bills and the people like paying and giving you an income are your current clients, and they're not necessarily focusing as much on them. And I think that's got to come first. It's kind of like before you add quantity, you got to focus on quality and like your volume within the gym. Same way with what you're doing with your clients. If you do a really good job with them and they love you, like they'd be good to give you like testimonials, potential referrals, and you just get a really great base. I wouldn't be in the position I am now where I can charge the amounts I do with the current clients I have without my base of clients who some of them were with me for like, I mean, I think I've had one client for like 6 years. It's just kind of ridiculous at this stage where like, I don't know if he's ever going to leave me, but he's there. And they were like the foundation that allowed me to grow. And if I'd been so focused on, again, social media followings and content, and sometimes I find myself leaning too far that way, it's certainly easy to do. I would have not had this foundation that allowed me to grow. So I think that's something that will really help people because I think people get really lost in social media and the content and the likes and what other people are doing. It's like, well, first, like nurture what you have at home and then like branch out where you can. And ultimately, following counts and stuff like that, they really don't mean a lot. Just like you said, like have that really good relationship with your clients. If you have a good relationship with the number of followers you currently have, you're more likely to get signups than people with like hundreds of thousands, but they don't like have any sort of relationship with that following at all.
Absolutely. I agree with that 100%. I think that's very, very sort of big problem at the moment is you see so many like business coaching courses as well, which are just focused on numbers, 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 and like shooting them up through the sky. And actually the quality of the coaching tends to suffer as a result of kind of doing that. So, sort out your own house first, and then you can start to expand out into the world. But it's a very good point. Well, thank you very much for coming on today. I massively appreciate your time. And where can people find you? And also, where can they also find your podcast?
For sure. Yeah. Thank you very much for having me. So I'd say the easiest place is probably revivestronger.com. Just has everything on there from our coaching to other things that they can check out. Revive Stronger is me on Instagram, where I'm most active. And then the podcast is, as you might expect, the Revive Stronger podcast over on any podcast provider and also on YouTube if people want to check that out. I have some vlogs that sometimes go over there, and we have the improvement season over there as well. Thanks
Yeah,
for having me again. I hope people enjoy this.
amazing. Thank you very much.